September 30th, 1999, Tokaimura, Japan. What began as an ordinary workday at a nuclear facility ended in unimaginable suffering and an agonizing 83-day battle for life. It is important to note that at the time, Japan's economy heavily depended on imported energy resources. This reliance eventually led the country to recognize the need for expanding its own energy sources. As a result, immense pressure was placed on the energy sector, putting workers at significant risk. Tokai Nuclear Power Plant was Japan's first atomic power station. Fuel for the plant was processed at a facility in Tokaimura. Here, workers converted uranium hexafluoride into enriched uranium dioxide. This material was then processed into pellets, which were later packed into tubes, sealed, and assembled into fuel rods, the primary source of nuclear energy. That day, Hisashi Ouchi, Masato Shinohara, and their supervisor Yutaka Yokokawa began their shift as usual. One of their key tasks was uranium mixing, which involved three crucial stages. Dissolution tank. An automated system mixed uranium powder, 5% concentration, with nitric acid. Buffer tank. A cylindrical reservoir that prevented critical mass, an uncontrolled nuclear fission chain reaction, and regulated uranium flow to the third stage. Precipitation tank. The final stage of the process. The process was strictly regulated. It was specified which substances should be transferred from which tank to which, and for how long they should be mixed. However, 3 years before the accident, the company changed this procedure to speed up the production of the hazardous material. Due to the growing demand for fuel rods, important steps began to be skipped. By violating established standards and bypassing regulatory approval, management allowed workers to manually mix uranium in stainless steel buckets instead of using automated equipment. This naturally contradicted all safety regulations. Until that day, there had been no accidents, possibly because the uranium levels were extremely low. By September 30th, 1999, the plant was already 2 days behind schedule on delivering nuclear fuel rods. The company increased pressure on the workers, demanding that they complete the process as quickly as possible. As a result, the technicians made additional changes to the procedure, making it even less safe. They began working even more carelessly and chose to wear regular, comfortable clothes instead of protective gear. This was the moment when the situation became truly dangerous. Around 10:35 a.m., Ouchi and Shinohara started mixing uranium powder in a steel bucket. However, they exceeded the permissible uranium concentration level by 7 times. Yokokawa was watching the process from his office, while Ouchi leaned over the precipitation tank and Shinohara stood on the platform, assisting in pouring the solution. And suddenly, the gamma radiation alarm went off. Ouchi, Shinohara, and Yokokawa realized they had made a terrible mistake. A flash of blue light, known as Cherenkov radiation, illuminated the room. This emitted an enormous amount of energy and created a shockwave similar to the sonic boom of supersonic aircraft. The permissible radiation dose for workers at nuclear facilities is between 20 and 50 millisieverts per year. However, as a result of the accident, the workers received a colossal dose of 30,000 millisieverts in total. Ouchi received the highest dose, 17,000 millisieverts, as he was close to the explosion of the reaction. Shinohara received 10,000 millisieverts. Since Yokokawa was further away, he received a lower dose, 3,000 millisieverts. Hisashi was exposed to the highest radiation dose ever recorded in documented history. Naturally, all three immediately tried to leave the site, but they were unable to, due to the intense pain that pierced their entire bodies. Following the emergency protocol for such situations, Ouchi and Shinohara ran to the decontamination room. There, Ouchi vomited and soon lost consciousness. Realizing the scale of the tragedy, the plant manager decided to urgently evacuate the remaining staff and shut down the plant for the rest of the day to prevent a radiation leak. Ouchi, Shinohara, and Yokokawa were transported to the National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Chiba. Shinohara and Yokokawa stayed in Chiba, where they received immediate medical assistance. But Ouchi. When the local doctors assessed Ouchi's condition, it was decided to urgently transport him to the University Hospital in Tokyo, where the best specialists and modern equipment for treating radiation victims were available. On the evening of September 30th, Ouchi arrived at the hospital in good spirits, and at first glance showed no serious signs of injury, which surprised both the nurses and the leading doctors at the clinic. His arm was swollen, and his skin appeared burned, as if from a severe sunburn. That was all. There were no other visible signs of what had happened. Some hospital staff even believed that he would soon recover and return home. However, the doctors soon realized that appearances could be deceiving, and this was the beginning of one of the most agonizing deaths in history. Later, the doctors examined his bone marrow, trying to understand the issue. However, the test results were so shocking that the medical team realized that Ouchi's case was far from ordinary. When the data was obtained, the doctors were confronted with a horrifying reality. Normally, the blood constantly regenerates cells using chromosomes, which contain DNA, a kind of blueprint for regeneration. However, Ouchi's mechanism was completely destroyed. Under the impact of powerful radiation, his chromosomes either fused together into chaotic structures or shattered into tiny fragments. They lost their normal shape and could no longer perform their function. The DNA damage was so severe that the process of cell regeneration in his body became impossible. At this point, the doctors realized they were facing a walking ghost. During this phase, a patient may appear healthy, but in reality their body is in an extremely fragile state. This period can last for several hours or even days, but eventually the condition deteriorates sharply. In Ouchi's case, radiation caused a dramatic drop in his white blood cell count, making his body even more vulnerable to various infections and diseases. His immune system was close to zero. Imagine that literally any touch could be fatal for you. This became Ouchi's reality, a life of constant fear of infection due to the complete lack of immunity. To protect Ouchi from external threats, the chief doctor decided to place him in a fully isolated, sterile room. However, the doctors understood that isolation could only reduce the risk of new infections, but it didn't solve the main problem: the damaged chromosomes that could no longer regenerate. Given the situation, there was only one possible treatment option left, which at the time was still considered experimental: a bone marrow transplant. The essence of the method was to introduce donor cells into the patient's body, which could potentially trigger the regeneration process. The chances of success were minimal, but there was still hope that Ouchi's chromosomes might start functioning again. However, for this, a donor with a very similar immune system was needed. Fortunately, the doctors managed to find the perfect match: Ouchi's biological sister. Ouchi became the first person in the world to undergo such a transplant. The surgery was successful. However, even though it went well, the doctors were hesitant to make any predictions. Ouchi himself seemed not to fully comprehend the severity of his situation, and would ask the doctors every day when he would be able to leave the hospital and go home. He also worried a lot that the radiation exposure might lead to leukemia. The doctors reassured him, telling him he had no chance of developing leukemia, and this was actually true, because his body didn't have enough time for leukemia to develop. He was dying faster than the disease could form. Ouchi's skin started losing its elasticity and peeling off when the medical staff removed the sticky tape that was used to secure the equipment on him. Ultimately, the doctors stopped using bandages and ceased applying anything to his skin. However, soon, fluid began to accumulate in his lungs, making it difficult for him to breathe. When Ouchi could no longer breathe on his own, he was connected to a ventilator with hopes that his body might still recover. On the 10th day after the bone marrow transplant, doctors conducted a test. At that moment, there was hope for his survival. His sister's stem cells began to spread throughout his body, indicating a positive response to the treatment. 2 days later, Ouchi's white blood cell count returned to normal, which seemed like a promising sign. However, this result turned out to be temporary. Radiation continued its destructive effect, and within a week, his condition sharply worsened. Disappointed by the failure, Dr. Maekawa performed an endoscopy to understand why the bone marrow transplant didn't yield the expected results. The damage discovered explained why the new chromosomes couldn't integrate. Ouchi's protective intestinal mucosa had completely died and started to peel off, Without this lining, the body loses its ability to absorb water, nutrients, and derive energy from food. Even without medical expertise, it was clear that Ouchi was doomed. His body could no longer process food, meaning he would inevitably die either from dehydration or starvation. But even this was not the worst fate that awaited him. Ouchi began suffering from severe gastrointestinal issues, losing up to 3 liters of fluid a day. His body completely lost control over the digestive processes, leading to internal bleeding. Without the protective intestinal lining, the blood loss became so severe that doctors had to perform up to 10 blood transfusions a day. Meanwhile, he endured constant unbearable pain and was kept on an IV drip with painkillers to slightly alleviate his suffering. Medical staff attempted to preserve moisture in his body by wrapping his body in bandages, but this only worsened the situation. The skin continued to peel off and release fluid. Due to the critical state of the patient, changing the bandages took almost half a day. Dr. Maekawa then made another unexpected decision: to perform a skin transplant in an attempt to slow down the loss of moisture from Ouchi's body. Like the bone marrow transplant, the operation itself was successful, but the new skin did not take. Soon, Ouchi's condition worsened even further. His eyelids completely necrosed, and he lost the ability to open or close his eyes. According to the nurses, they even noticed him crying blood on one occasion. Chances of survival were almost non-existent, but his family refused to lose hope, pleading with the doctors to do everything they could. To relieve Ouchi's unbearable suffering, the doctors placed him in an artificial coma, and vital functions were supported with medical equipment. However, unexpectedly, even while in a coma, his heart began to beat twice as fast as normal before suddenly stopping. He was resuscitated 3 times, despite his pleas to end his suffering. The next day, Ouchi's liver failed, and a day after that, his kidneys shut down. However, the measures taken by the doctors continued to grow more complex, as their interest in studying Ouchi's condition, symptoms, and responses to treatment surpassed their concern for his agony. The justification for keeping Ouchi alive for such a prolonged period became a topic of heated debate after his potential death. Scientists and medical workers argued that the data they collected from his case would be valuable for future radiation injuries. His family also continued to hope, long after the accident, that Ouchi might somehow miraculously recover. As the end approached, Ouchi literally begged the doctors to let him die, telling them, "I am not a guinea pig." Dr. Maekawa finally realized that there was no hope of saving him and asked Ouchi's family to sign a document prohibiting resuscitation in the event of another cardiac arrest. And so, on December 21, 1999, after 83 days of unbearable suffering, 35-year-old Ouchi's heart stopped for the final time. His colleague Shinohara, who had received a lethal dose of radiation, survived longer, until April 2000. However, his suffering was nothing compared to what Ouchi endured. Their superior Yokokawa survived, as he had been exposed to the least radiation. However, he was soon convicted of negligence and safety violations and sentenced to prison. The company, JCO, where all 3 worked, paid 12.6 billion yen as compensation to the victims' families. But as is well known, no amount of money can replace the loss of human life.